Israel went into Lebanon expecting a clean operation. What Hezbollah had waiting for them underground, in the tunnels, in the hills, in the villages, was something Israeli intelligence had completely failed to predict. And when it was over, the casualty numbers told a story that shook the entire Middle East to its foundation. Let's start with a fact that most people don't know. Bint Jbeil is not just a town. It is not just another cluster of limestone buildings perched on the hills of southern Lebanon, 20 kilometers north of the Israeli border. Bint Jbeil is a symbol. It is a wound in the memory of the Israeli military that has never fully healed. It is the place where, in the summer of 2006, Hezbollah fighters stopped the Israeli army cold. In close quarters urban combat so brutal, so costly, and so deeply humiliating that IDF commanders came back from that battle having fundamentally revised everything they thought they knew about fighting a non-state armed group in complex terrain. They called it a spiderweb speech location, named after the famous speech that Hezbollah's then leader Hassan Nasrallah delivered in that very town's stadium in the year 2000, calling Israel a spiderweb that would collapse at the first strike of real resistance. In 2006, Nasrallah proved his point inside those streets. And in 2026, 20 years later, Israeli soldiers were back in Bint Jbeil, and Hezbollah was waiting for them again. To understand what happened in 2026, you need to understand the road that led there. And that road begins not with a military decision, but with a pager. On September 17, 2024, thousands of Hezbollah operatives across Lebanon were simultaneously maimed and killed when pagers, communication devices the organization had switched to specifically to avoid Israeli signals intelligence, detonated without warning. The attack was widely attributed to Israeli intelligence and was, by every technical measure, one of the most sophisticated covert operations in the history of modern warfare. In a single afternoon, Israel decapitated Hezbollah's field communication network, sent shockwaves of terror through the organization's entire operational structure, and demonstrated a level of supply chain infiltration that security analysts are still struggling to fully comprehend. The pager attack was followed, the very next day, by coordinated explosions of Hezbollah walkie-talkies. Then came airstrikes. On September 27, 2024, Israeli jets dropped bunker buster bombs on the southern suburbs of Beirut, the Dahieh neighborhood, Hezbollah's institutional heartland, and killed Hassan Nasrallah himself, the man who had led Hezbollah for over 30 years, the most consequential non-state military commander the modern Middle East had ever produced. In the space of 10 days, Israel had done what many analysts had considered impossible. It had broken the spine of Hezbollah's command structure, killed its supreme leader, and demonstrated that no target was unreachable. Israel then crossed the blue line on October 1, 2024, the sixth time it had invaded Lebanon since 1978. The invasion moved quickly through villages that Hezbollah had evacuated, capturing weapons caches, destroying tunnel infrastructure, seizing command posts. The IDF reported 56 soldiers killed during the invasion. Hezbollah reported figures suggesting far higher Israeli casualties, figures Israel disputed. The Lebanese Health Ministry counted 2,120 people killed in Lebanon during this period, the vast majority of whom it described as civilians. The invasion ended abruptly on November 27, 2024, when a U.S.-brokered ceasefire came into effect, requiring Hezbollah to reposition its fighters north of the Litani River, approximately 30 kilometers from the Israeli border, while Israeli forces were supposed to withdraw from Lebanese territory. The world exhaled. Analysts declared that Hezbollah had been severely degraded. Some said it would take a decade to recover. Some said it would never fully recover. Some said the organization, disciplined, entrenched, ideologically hardened, backed by Iran with decades of weapons and money, was finished as a military force capable of threatening Israel. Those analysts were wrong. Here is what happened during the ceasefire that the headlines never adequately captured. While the world was watching Gaza, while diplomatic attention focused on hostage negotiations and American election politics, Hezbollah was doing what it has always done in the aftermath of military setbacks. It was rebuilding, not slowly, not cautiously, urgently and systematically. According to multiple intelligence assessments, Hezbollah handed over control of 190 out of 265 of its military positions to the Lebanese army, as required by the ceasefire agreement, while retaining significant embedded infrastructure in the villages of southern Lebanon that had not been physically destroyed during the invasion. The organization's logistical genius, developed over 4 decades of fighting Israel, lies precisely in its understanding that southern Lebanon's terrain, its limestone hills riddled with natural cave systems, its centuries-old village architecture with basements and cellars that connect underground, its olive groves and orchard terrain that provides natural cover from aerial surveillance, is itself a weapon. You cannot bomb geography. You cannot destroy a hill. And into those hills, Hezbollah had spent 30 years building something that no airstrike could reach and that no intelligence satellite could fully map. Meanwhile, Israel was not withdrawing either. Despite the ceasefire agreement requiring Israeli forces to leave Lebanon by January 26, 2025, and then again by a revised deadline of February 18, 2025, Israel refused to fully comply. It pulled troops from Lebanese villages but maintained 5 military outposts on strategic highlands near the Israeli communities of Shlomi, Zaret, Avivim, Margaliot, and Metula. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz declared in April 2025 that Israeli forces would indefinitely remain in what he called security zones in Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. Israel continued conducting near-daily airstrikes in Lebanon throughout 2025, killing 331 people, at least 127 of them civilians, in the 12 months following the ceasefire. The Lebanese Health Ministry was keeping a running count. Hezbollah was keeping a different kind of count. Every strike, every dead commander, every demolished building was logged not as a loss, but as a ledger entry, a debt to be collected when conditions allowed. Conditions changed on February 28, 2026. That was the day Operation Epic Fury began, the joint U.S.-Israeli strike campaign against Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and struck over 1,000 targets in Iranian territory in a single coordinated assault. Within hours, the entire regional alliance system that Iran had spent 40 years constructing, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi forces in Yemen, proxy militias in Iraq and Syria, received its standing orders. On March 2, 2026, Hezbollah launched projectiles into northern Israel for the first time since the November 2024 ceasefire, targeting a missile defense site south of Haifa. Hezbollah announced explicitly that it was restarting fighting to force Israel to stop its aggression and evacuate from occupied Lebanese territories, and emphasized that the move was unrelated to the Iran war, a careful legal and diplomatic framing designed to establish Hezbollah's action as a separate, sovereign Lebanese resistance issue rather than an Iranian proxy operation. Israel did not accept that framing. Within hours, Israeli jets struck targets in Beirut at 3 a.m. local time, issuing evacuation orders to civilians in 50 villages across southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. The 2026 Lebanon war had begun. What followed over the next 6 weeks was one of the most intense, sustained military confrontations between Israel and Hezbollah since 2006. Hezbollah fired drones and as many as 2,000 rockets into Israel. Israel conducted hundreds of airstrikes across southern Lebanon, Beirut, and the Bekaa Valley, blowing up the main bridges on the Litani River to cut off the south from resupply lines from the north. Israeli ground forces pushed into the south. The 36th Division, the 91st Division, the 146th Division, the 162nd Division. Multiple armored formations moving simultaneously through terrain they had entered before, terrain they thought they understood. And then, on April 9, 2026, coinciding deliberately and provocatively with the second day of the Iran war ceasefire, in a move that outraged Lebanon, Iran, Pakistan, and Hezbollah simultaneously, Israel launched the main ground assault on Bint Jbeil. The operation was named Silver Plow, and Bint Jbeil was ready. To understand what Hezbollah had prepared inside Bint Jbeil, you need to strip away the propaganda from both sides and look at the physical, documented, verified reality that emerged from the fighting itself. This was not a city defended by a few hundred militia fighters with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. This was a city that had been transformed, over years of methodical preparation, into a layered defensive killing ground. The Kasbah, the ancient fortified quarter at the city's heart, contained connected underground passages through which fighters could move between buildings without exposing themselves to aerial surveillance or Israeli drones. Weapons had been stockpiled inside civilian infrastructure, including, as the IDF documented and published, a hospital in the city that Israeli troops raided after intelligence indicated it had been converted into a weapons storage and surveillance hub. The IDF claimed to have killed 20 militants during that hospital operation alone. Hezbollah countered by accusing Israel of attacking medical facilities in violation of international law, a charge that carried particular weight, given that Doctors Without Borders had reported its healthcare staff were injured by Israeli forces at Hiram Hospital in Tyre during the same period. Both things were simultaneously true and deeply complicated, which is the nature of urban warfare in the cities where military and civilian presence is inextricably intertwined. Israeli armored units, Merkava tanks, the most battle-hardened and technologically advanced tanks Israel fields, advanced along the Bint Jbeil highway toward the Al-Awaini neighborhood in an attempt to reach the local stadium, the same stadium where Nasrallah had delivered his spiderweb speech in 2000, the same stadium that had become the symbolic prize of this entire operation. Israeli forces approached to within approximately 300 to 400 meters of the stadium's perimeter before Hezbollah stopped their advance. Stopped it with a combination of anti-tank guided missiles fired from concealed positions in the city's dense stone architecture with rocket barrages aimed directly at Israeli troop concentrations, and with the kind of close-quarters ambush tactics that Hezbollah fighters had been training for in these specific streets against this specific enemy for the better part of 2 decades. The commander of the 401st Brigade's 52nd Battalion was seriously wounded during fighting in the Bint Jbeil area. 10 Israeli soldiers from the 35th Paratroopers Brigade were wounded, 3 of them seriously, in a single overnight battle with Hezbollah fighters. A Hezbollah projectile fired near the Lebanese border injured 8 Israeli soldiers, 5 of them severely. Among those seriously injured was the son of Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a detail that traveled instantly through Israeli social media and political circles, making viscerally personal a conflict that politicians had been managing at a comfortable rhetorical distance. On April 12th, Israeli forces had cut off all main roads leading to Bint Jbeil and were pounding the city with airstrikes, artillery shells, and, according to Lebanese sources, white phosphorus munitions. White phosphorus, when used in civilian-populated areas, generates international legal controversy because of the burns it produces and the difficulty of distinguishing legitimate smoke screening use from use as an incendiary weapon against people. But, despite surrounding the city, despite the artillery, despite the airstrikes, despite the white phosphorus claims, Israeli forces still could not capture the city's key sites. The IDF's own statements acknowledged that complete takeover is expected to take a few more days, a timeline that kept extending, days becoming a week threatening to become 2, as Hezbollah fighters refused to yield the Kasbah and the dense residential core that formed the battle's decisive terrain. On April 13th, the IDF claimed to have killed over 100 Hezbollah fighters in Bint Jbeil in the preceding days and to have successfully encircled the city. On the same day, 1 IDF sergeant was killed in combat in southern Lebanon. The battle was costing Israel soldiers, time, ammunition, and the one resource that matters more than any of those in the age of information warfare: narrative. Because Bint Jbeil, for Hezbollah, was never purely a military objective. It was a communications operation wrapped inside a military operation. Every day that Israeli forces failed to capture the city was a day that Hezbollah's media apparatus could broadcast as proof that the Israeli military, with all its technology, its F-35 fighter jets, its Merkava tanks, its drone swarms, its signals intelligence networks, could not break the resistance of men fighting in their own streets for their own ground. And that message was landing. It was landing in the displaced communities of southern Lebanon, scattered across Beirut and the Bekaa I.O. It was landing in the Palestinian territories. It was landing in Jordan, in Egypt, in Turkey, in every corner of the Arab world where the question of whether resistance against Israeli military power was possible had taken on an almost existential psychological weight, after years of Israeli military dominance had seemed to settle the question decisively. Hezbollah understood, as it always has, that in asymmetric warfare, survival is victory. Not dying is winning. Making the enemy pay in blood and time and political capital for every meter of ground is the entire strategic theory. And in Bint Jbeil, that theory was holding. The broader trajectory of the 2026 Lebanon war tells a story of extraordinary destruction on both sides. Since the resumption of fighting in early March 2026, more than 2,000 militants and civilians were killed in Lebanon by late April, and over 1 million people, representing 20% of Lebanon's entire population, were displaced from their homes, creating a humanitarian crisis that the United Nations described as among the most acute it had witnessed in the region since the 2006 war. The Lebanese government, the same government that had for years walked a careful political tightrope between Hezbollah's armed power and the international community's demands for disarmament, condemned Hezbollah's renewed strikes against Israel as endangering and undermining the Lebanese state. It moved to ban Hezbollah's military activities, called on the group to place its weapons under government control, and ended unauthorized attacks from Lebanese territory. Lebanon was simultaneously condemning the organization that controlled large parts of its territory, while that organization was fighting a war on Lebanese soil against one of the world's most powerful armies. The Lebanese state was, in every meaningful sense, a country being consumed by a conflict it could not control and could not afford. Then came April 8th, 2026, a day that Lebanon called Black Wednesday. Shortly after the announcement of a ceasefire to the broader Iran war, Israel launched what its own military described as its most powerful attacks on Lebanon since the conflict began. Operation Eternal Darkness, 50 Israeli Air Force fighter jets, approximately 160 munitions, over 100 targets hit within a 10-minute window. The attacks killed at least 357 people. Casualty count among the highest single-day tolls of the entire 2026 Lebanon war. Lebanon's hospitals were flooded. Associated Press journalists reported charred bodies and vehicles, and on the ground, at one of Beirut's busiest intersections in the Corniche al-Mazrah neighborhood, a mixed commercial and residential area. An Israeli airstrike targeted a cemetery in the Bekaa Valley village of Shmustar during a funeral, killing at least 10 mourners. 3 girls were killed in the coastal town of Adlaun, south of Sidon. The IDF claimed it had struck only Hezbollah targets. headquarters, intelligence centers, missile infrastructure. A member of the Beirut municipality said publicly, "This is a residential area. There's nothing military here." No, Israel's actions were condemned by over 20 observer states and the United Nations. The European Union and the United Kingdom called for Lebanon to be included in the Iran war ceasefire. The attack disrupted the very ceasefire it followed by hours. And here is the geopolitical dimension that transforms this from a regional military story into a global one. The Battle of Bint Jbeil and the broader 2026 Lebanon war are being watched with extraordinary intensity by every state actor that has a stake in understanding whether non-state armed organizations, equipped with precision weapons, underground infrastructure, and disciplined urban warfare doctrine, can hold their own against technologically superior conventional military forces. Russia is watching, not just because Russia and Iran have aligned geopolitical interests, and not just because Iran supplied Russia with Shahed drones that changed the dynamics of the Ukraine war, but because the urban warfare being conducted in Bint Jbeil validates or challenges the fundamental assumptions of Russian military doctrine about the relationship between air power, armor, and infantry in complex urban terrain. China is watching. Because China's entire Taiwan invasion strategy assumes that the ability to absorb punishment, dig in, and force an attacker to pay unsustainable costs in urban environments can be decisive even against vastly superior firepower. Every building that Hezbollah holds in Bint Jbeil is a data point in Beijing's war planning models. Turkey is watching because Turkey has ambitions in the Arab world and needs to understand the military balance in Lebanon to calibrate its diplomatic positioning. Iran, now in the midst of its own military crisis, is watching because Hezbollah is Iran's most important and most capable proxy, the crown jewel of the axis of resistance, and whether that proxy survives the 2026 Lebanon war with its organizational coherence intact will determine Iran's regional influence for the next generation. The human cost accumulating beneath these geopolitical calculations is staggering. The World Bank's Lebanon Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, published in 2025, covering only the 2024 invasion before the 2026 war began, already found total conflict costs of $14 billion for Lebanon, with $6 billion in housing sector damages alone, and a 1% decline in Lebanon's real GDP in 2024. Amnesty International documented the damaging or destruction of over 10,000 buildings between October 2024 and January 2025, with 90% of the homes in Kfar Kila destroyed. More than 60 schools destroyed, according to Save the Children. The Lebanese Health Ministry counted damage to 68 hospitals and 63 primary healthcare facilities. These numbers belong to the previous round. The 2026 war has added to every one of them. Lebanon, a country that was already economically shattered before a single shot was fired in 2023, a country whose currency had collapsed, whose banking system had imploded, whose infrastructure was crumbling, is now absorbing a second consecutive devastating military conflict in 2 years, with no credible reconstruction funding in sight and no political resolution that addresses the fundamental question of who controls weapons in Lebanese territory. And through all of this, Hezbollah endures. The organization that Israel's intelligence establishment was certain it had broken in 2024, through the pager attacks, through the killing of Nasrallah, through the invasion, through hundreds of targeted strikes on commanders and logistics networks, has reconstituted enough operational capacity to fight Israeli armored divisions to a standstill in the streets of Bint Jbeil in April 2026. More than 1,800 Hezbollah fighters have been killed since the resumption of fighting in late February 2026, according to IDF figures. Figures that would represent a catastrophic loss for any conventional military force, and yet have not broken Hezbollah's ability to contest ground, fire rockets into Israel, ambush Israeli armored columns, and conduct operations that impose real military costs on one of the most capable armies in the world. The reason is organizational architecture. Hezbollah does not fight like an army. It fights like a distributed network of semi-autonomous cells, each capable of independent action, each drawing on pre-positioned weapons and pre-surveyed terrain, each motivated by an ideological framework that has convinced its fighters that dying in resistance is not a loss, but a form of victory. You cannot destroy that architecture with airstrikes alone. You can disrupt it, degrade it, set it back by months or years. But as long as southern Lebanon exists as physical geography, and as long as there are men willing to fight in it for causes they believe transcend their own survival, Hezbollah will reconstitute. It has done it after 1982, after 1996, after 2000, after 2006, after 2024. The 2026 war will not be the last chapter. On April 16, 2026, President Trump announced that Israel and Lebanon had agreed to a 10-day truce, with ceasefire talks beginning that were described by observers as historic. The Israeli military, meanwhile, announced that IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir had declared the IDF in a state of war in Lebanon despite the Iran ceasefire, maintaining the position that the Lebanese front was a separate theater requiring separate resolution. Netanyahu said publicly that Israel was maintaining full freedom of action against any threat in Lebanon, while accusing Hezbollah of seeking to sabotage peace talks. Hezbollah's parliamentary bloc leader Mohammed Rad called on the Lebanese government to withdraw from direct negotiations with Israel, saying any contact between Lebanese and Israeli officials amid an ongoing war was a source of shame. The political process and the military process were running simultaneously in opposite directions, with no guarantee that either would resolve anything. Here is what the story of Hezbollah's counterattack in Lebanon ultimately reveals about the nature of power in the modern Middle East. The era in which Israeli military supremacy was